It really is wonderful to be here. I had a fantastic but very filled day yesterday, and am really just delighted to have a chance to converse with you a little bit further about what we're doing at NSF, but also about what you're doing, because actually, of course, the NSF doesn't really get to do very much without the field doing its work. You know, we are here essentially to serve the community, to advance science and education for the country. I should also just make a small correction. I was appointed at Michigan State University, but when I really joined the government for real after my rotation at NSF, I stepped down from that position. Still have great friends and colleagues at Michigan State, which I guess is okay to say here at Illinois. And I wore green yesterday, but I figured not today. Anyway, so I have a few slides where I'd like to just chat about really three big basic themes. One is kind of an NSF at a glance, mostly because we have a new director and we have some new slides. So I wanted to be sure to use them. Secondly, we'll talk about education at NSF, and then a few pointers about what's new, where we're headed, and to think about the future. So NSF at a glance. We are, of course, a federal agency. We make grants. That's our business. We are organized, and I'll get to the org slide in a minute, but we're organized in ways that provide space for disciplinary focus and a push toward research. $7.3 billion budget. We're quite unique in government in that 94% of our budget goes directly back out to funded research. We have very low overhead inside the agency, actually. I find this figure interesting, 50,000 proposals annually. Just for those of you that I met yesterday who are grad students who have GRFs, that does not include the GRF submissions. We run the GRF as a separate operation, and I just heard that in this latest round we have tentatively 21,000 applications to GRF. Last year it was 15,000. Now whether they'll all really finish and get in, we'll see. But I would like to get them to change this slide so that we reflect GRF as well, perhaps. And we fund about 11,000. That also doesn't include GRF, which means that roughly 80% of the people are unhappy with NSF most of the time. And that's important to remember, because those 80% of people who aren't getting funded also have fantastic ideas, great work, and this success rate being so low is a concern to the agency. And so one thing that we really are starting to think about, and we didn't talk much about it yesterday, but we could, might be ways that universities could be more attuned to their own patterns of application, their own success rates. I'm sure you are here. And really think about strategies internally to maybe be sure people are ready before proposals come in. That may or may not be an issue here, but it is something we're talking about. We're also looking at ways to handle the review process in a more streamlined fashion, perhaps a little more triaging for proposals that really rate very low before we have panels and so forth. And so anyway, it's a big operation, roughly 300,000 folks around the country with NSF support. We're organized. You have to have an org chart if you work for the government. So trust us, we're organized. We have units, directorates they are called, and so we have a director, Dr. Cordova, and then each directorate is headed by an assistant director. And so Education and Human Resources is one of the 7. Just an interesting little bit of history. EHR is funded separately, has a separate appropriation line. The other 6 are funded collectively and called the Research and Related Activities Directorates. I have my own small protest going on where I typically don't call them the Research and Related Activities Directorates. I call them the other directorates. We love the other directorates. We collaborate, but EHR is a Research and Related Activity Directorate in terms of the substance of our work. And I want to keep sending that message. So anyway, that's just my little thing. And our budget is sizable, $846.5 million in the 14-year. Roughly a little less than half of that budget currently is being coded as headed toward what we would call research and development. A big chunk of the EHR budget goes toward scholarships, fellowships, and direct services of different kinds. So we can talk more about that, but this concept of bringing up our research core is a major emphasis for the directorate. Just a couple of things here that I think are interesting. The number of students supported through GRF over here, 47,800 since 52, we have talked a lot about whether there ought to be ways to really bring that group together, virtually at least, into more of a cohort or set of cohorts. We try to follow, we definitely do follow National Academy elections and Nobel Prizes, and we have data about which of those folks are former GRFs, and we actually used to say under Dr. Suresh, our previous director, that NSF knew how to pick people way before the Nobel Committee knew how to pick them by selecting the GRF. So it is certainly a signature program for us. Now, a little bit about highlights of education at NSF, since I'm hosted here by the College of Education so graciously, and I am fascinated really by the history of NSF's education. That started when I was a graduate student at New Hampshire, where my faculty mentors were people who had kind of grown up academically in the 50s and 60s. And so one of the things that we had to do as graduate students was to memorize, this is kind of dumb as I think back on it, memorize the alphabet soup of the new math and the new science era. So we had to know what SMSG stood for and so on and so forth. And we had to know who the key figures were in those projects. And we had to be able to talk about the significance of that work historically for the fields of mathematics and science education. And so it was quite a long time ago when I actually first heard of Max Biberman, who was just a towering figure nationally and here at the University of Illinois. He was the head of something called the University of Illinois Committee on School Mathematics. He founded that, I believe, in 1951. And it was an alliance of the colleges of education, engineering, and liberal arts and sciences. And his idea was we in education and in mathematics need to figure out how to improve K through 12 education, particularly high school education. And so he was the lead on this UICSM project. And back at New Hampshire, I can remember the little library where we had the materials and we were asked to look at them and analyze them. This was a very widely used, not as widely used as SMSG, the School Mathematics Study Group, but it was a very widely used set of materials in those years, and it influenced the future of high school mathematics education by modernizing it, by taking it from a sort of procedural, skill-oriented, arithmetic-based kind of curriculum more toward a meaningful, logic-oriented, reasoning-oriented, theorem-oriented sort of curriculum. So he was just an incredible figure, and I've run into people here already who knew him and worked with him. And there were others, Bob Davis, who was famous for Plato and the Madison Project, and Peter Braunfeld, David Page, and several others. So the university has this great history of significant involvement in leading improvement in K through 12 education. And it was tied in different ways to research about teaching and learning, not only in studies of impact of this curriculum, but in the psychology that drove much of the work. So congratulations to Illinois for continuing this wonderful tradition and strong relationship with NSF. Biberman's grants were among the very first education grants funded at the National Science Foundation. And Peter Braunfeld and Bob Davis were not far behind, and they began these traditions of teacher summer institutes and working directly with teachers to get their math content up to speed. Anyway. So by way of history for the NSF education, in addition to the K-12 work that I just mentioned, where Illinois had such a significant role, the graduate research fellowships were the other early program, starting in 1952. And the reason for that was, as I understand it, simply the fact that it was in the post-war years, and there was an assumption that if the government didn't pay to get folks to go to graduate school and to prepare to be scientists and engineers, people might not elect to do so. There wasn't yet a real system of funding graduate education, and so the notion was to step up the entry into the STEM workforce. Now, over the years, the education investment, which really started in just these two areas, has changed quite a lot, and in some ways, it's gotten almost too broad. What's been interesting to me in this visit is that pretty much everything listed here, there's someone that I've run into who's doing work in one of these areas still. So you've stayed right in step with the National Science Foundation. In the 60s, there was the beginning of a focus on undergraduate instruction. That's not surprising, but it came after the focus on K-12. The 70s was the beginning of our programs for improving education for minorities and groups that have been underrepresented in STEM, and so forth. In the 80s, an interesting moment, the Education Directorate was shut down briefly, following a lot of political difficulty over a couple of decades. But in that same time, the administration, the president at the time, President Reagan, decided that he wanted to be sure to send the signal that the government recognized and honored teachers. And so we started the Presidential Awards for Excellence in Math and Science Teaching that continues today. That started in the 80s in the Reagan administration. That's also when our research efforts took real shape in the mid-80s. We had always funded education research, but we really began to pick it up into the 80s with the program called Research on Teaching and Learning, run by Ray Hanapel. At least Jose might remember, and others perhaps. But that was the beginning of serious, visible investment. We also funded during those years, by the way, the first presidential young investigator doing research in education, Erna Yekel at Purdue Calumet. And so continuing on then, you're more currently aware of what we're doing, focus in the 2000s on digital libraries, cyber learning, currently cybersecurity, big data research, and so forth. So we see a real evolution, but what we don't see is much dropping off. And that has created a challenge for education at NSF. We are really quite expansive in what we address, which means that in no single area are we able to invest so significantly that we can perhaps achieve the kind of sustained development and improvement that we might like to see. It's an issue that probably we'll be discussing more fully. So what's new at NSF? And this is where I want to just point you to a few trends, a few ideas. Many of you are completely current with what's on our website and what solicitations have been released and which ones are about to be released and so forth. So this is not meant to be a march through the programs. It's meant more to be a sort of discussion of some ideas that we're talking about a lot at the agency. So this is not new. This is Vannevar Bush, whose influential writing was critical to the formation of the National Science Foundation. But I wanted to share it because the sentiment here is kind of in the DNA of NSF, this notion that science won't progress unless we think about the human capital as part of scientific capital. And so this is very deeply entrenched, that NSF needs to be about advancing the progress of science by advancing, in part, the growth and involvement of the people who will do that science and who will use that science. So I have taken my own interpretation of this quote when he talks about the application of science to practical purposes. That, to me, I think is the basis, or can be construed as the basis, for why we also invest in scientific literacy and in the preparation of K through 12 students. This notion that you really won't be able to build the human capital for science unless there's a culture and climate for science in the country, is fundamental to Bush's early thinking. And I tell you this because, as you are writing a very specific proposal to do a bit of research in mathematics education that is looking at some extremely important, complex, but fine-grained topic, I just tell you to try to keep in the back of your mind this focus on development of the scientific capital for the country, because occasionally that's very much on the minds of reviewers. And as we increase our emphasis in research in EHR, and we still involve a wide range of expertise in the review communities, finding ways to connect the dots between your very particular work and what might actually ultimately be of help to the development of a diverse scientific workforce that's ready for innovation. Finding ways to do that will be really important. It's important when you write your proposal, and actually it's important when you start to release your findings. It's important to have in some kind of implications section or something, some prospective ideas about why this can be useful. We are very much under pressure to be sure that we're able to argue that the investment NSF makes, even in basic research, has a benefit to society. So that's my little lecture on make sure you can connect the dots. Nonetheless, fantastic work going on here. That's not meant to be critical of the work. Just keep in mind, this is what we're about. So every directorate has its own advisory committee. NSF is governed, the policy piece of our work is overseen by the National Science Board, which is a presidentially nominated and appointed board. And then each directorate has its own advisory committee comprised of experts and very distinguished folks in the field. And these advisory committees are unevenly used. Some people here in the room have been on the advisory committees and chairs of advisory committees. Sometimes they are really heavily involved in the work of the directorates, and other times, frankly, from the inside. The meetings are seen as, oh my gosh, we've got to get ready for the advisory committee again. What will we show them? But in EHR, we have been really working for the last 4 years at making this an interactive activity with the advisory committee. And some of you would know Roy P. at Stanford. He's on this advisory committee. And a year and a half or so ago at one of the meetings, Roy said to then Director Suresh and Deputy Director Cora Merritt, Roy said to them, so could we actually, like maybe write a document that would advise EHR about where they should be going and what they should be funding? And I held my breath and I thought, they're going to say yes. I know they're going to say yes to this. And then what will we have? Who knows what this will be. So they did. They said, oh yes, what a great idea. Let's get that to happen. It has happened. It's been completed. Our advisory committee, under the leadership of Lee Todd, who was the President Emeritus of the University of Kentucky, the AC just released a strategic re-envisioning for EHR document last May. And as I've been out and about starting to talk about this document, there's enough interest that I think we'll try to figure out a way to have some sort of a comment opportunity on our website or some kind of blog or something. But the document says, it chooses these 3 areas, and these are areas that we've been working with inside the Directorate as a way to frame this very diverse, wide span of work that we do and funding that we offer. They took up those same 3 categories, which are first, learning and learning environments. The idea there being that our investments, some portion of them, ought to fall into the category of trying to improve STEM learning and the environments in which STEM learning occurs through research primarily, but also through other kinds of direct interventions. People come in and say they'd like to try a summer workshop for kids in some topic, and they're going to study and evaluate it. That counts as work on improving learning and learning environments, where we're always interested in what can be learned from that work that can translate nationally. So this is catalytic work. It's not meant to be sustained in most cases, but instead, like the rest of NSF, what can be discovered about how to do this well that could inform the improvement infrastructure across the nation. So learning and learning environments, they like that. They had a lot to say about it. Broadening participation, a major focus for the entire agency. By this we mean creating access and opportunity for high quality learning for the groups of people who have traditionally been underrepresented in the STEM fields. And so the Directorate for Education and Human Resources has several programs that are aimed at broadening participation, and I'll say more about this in a minute. And then the third is kind of new for us. It's partly because we were struggling to find a way to fit the GRF program, which is based in EHR, and the AGEP program based in EHR, and SFS, the Cyber Core program. I'll tell you a little more about that in a minute. Some programs that many of you probably don't know terribly well because you're focused on our research programs, but programs that are in our directorate that we wanted to see fitting inside a frame and think about where they can contribute to this broader set of ideas. So we've added, and with the advisory committee's agreement, added this category of STEM workforce development. It's kind of central to the early NSF thinking. And so we'll get to what that means in a moment. So they have outlined for us a set of at least 61, because I went through and pulled them all out, at least 61 recommendations. They don't call them all recommendations. It's more of a narrative. But they're really saying, here's what EHR ought to look like for the future. And they are stakeholders representing the field. So I wanted to say more about what they've told us, because this can be the beginning of a conversation with the community. So here's just one from the learning and learning environments piece, but they are very focused on what's possible for learning. They're urging us, which means they're urging you, through our programs, to start to look at how to improve our understanding of learning given the growth of data-intensive tools and analyses. So this is sort of learning in a cyber world, learning with new methodologies for tracking, understanding, and improving learning. They raise some questions. They talk about variables that are of interest. Not always variables that we see a lot of work on coming through NSF. Motivation, engagement, mindset, productive persistence, and so forth. Very important outcome kinds of variables where there's great unevenness in how well these can be measured and great need for the development of instruments and so forth. So they are encouraging a kind of forward-looking focus in research on teaching and learning, on learning environments that is aimed at, and I like this last sentence, making challenging content available for each and every learner, for all students. So this concept of equal access to high quality STEM learning is really central in their idea. And we're meeting with them starting tomorrow, actually, for 2 days. We'll have a long discussion about what our staff is doing with these ideas. So I share this all with you because it's quite public now, and I expect this will shape what we do in STEM education going forward. Here's another thing that I wanted to mention. Despite the fact that I don't call them the R and RAs, I am really quite collegial with my colleagues across the agency. And the partnerships that we are developing there are crucial to advancing STEM teaching, learning, and education generally. So I just brought out a couple of examples from the Computer and Information Science and Engineering Directorate size, where we are really interested in seeing proposals come in, and then we're open to co-funding. One is this, the big data solicitation that is looking at advancing big data science and engineering, in particular for the study of learning and the improvement of learning. And then DIBS, the Data Infrastructure Building Blocks. You may have seen some press on a project that we funded recently at Carnegie Mellon under DIBS with Ken Cadinger as the PI. It is looking at building basically a data sharing infrastructure for studying education questions. They had a start on that through a previous project, and now through DIBS with EHR funding and SIZE funding, and I think maybe some engineering funding, we have just supported a brand new project that is going to much more broadly look at interoperability of learning-based data sets, which include everything from keystroke clickstream data to data about students and teachers, data about curriculum being used. And the minute this was funded, there was great concern about privacy issues coming in the press. And so you've probably seen these papers, and it's really going to be interesting to watch. So it's a good example of a place where we're really relying on the experience and knowledge base well beyond education to try to move this work forward. Now, broadening participation, again, an area that I mentioned we've been funding since the 70s. We have several very clear programs aimed particularly at minority-serving institutions and intended to build their capacity to do more STEM in their faculty ranks, therefore making more STEM available to their students. Here's what our committee has said about broadening participation, which we love this, but this is a shift. View broadening participation as a solution, not a problem to be solved. So this is to say, take an asset orientation toward broadening participation. Take the view that to create, going back to Vannevar Bush's words, to create this scientific capital, the men and women who will do science and be able to use it, will mean believing in, supporting, and developing and nurturing talent from all sectors, from all groups, from the people who have not been well represented in STEM, taking as a given that there is going to be talent and capacity and interest there, and figuring out how our programs reflect that point of view. So we take this as a really interesting challenge, and they offer some ideas about communities and networked communities and emerging communities, and thinking about how to diminish limitations that previously have held people out of these fields. So we're not exactly sure what this would look like as we try to think it through, but they are challenging us to say, take a very proactive and positive asset-oriented view here. So that is the broadening participation. We did find a project that we wanted to show you. It's at the University of Puerto Rico, I believe. But it's an informal science education project. This is to introduce a program that we have that I didn't hear much about yesterday. Advancing informal STEM learning. So this is about outside of school learning. This is a citizen science project. So I guess the award is to the Conservation Trust of Puerto Rico. And it says here that over 2,000 people participated in this first round. They are monitoring insect populations and bat populations using citizen science techniques. Partly as a way to engage folks with very diverse backgrounds and knowledge and understanding. And this is quite common across NSF. EHR invests in citizen science because we're interested in its potential for helping people learn. It's a learning environment, essentially. The other directorates also invest in it because they are interested in getting their science done. And a lot of times the science needs lots of hands, lots of observations, lots of folks in the field. So this is one example. And then finally on the STEM workforce, which is their third focal area in the advisory committee report, trying to push us a little bit out of the projection category, which is difficult. You know, it's not always the best way for a basic funding agency to engage, but instead to start to look at personalized learning, at career-long learning, career shifts. How will people what's the right base for folks as they contemplate careers where they may move around and change their emphasis and so forth. And so they're encouraging us to invest more in this type of research. We have a very small portfolio here so far, but we're interested, I think, in seeing what might come of it. A couple of projects, one here, Deborah Bragg's work in the ATE program, which I didn't hear a lot about yesterday, so I wanted to highlight it here, the Advanced Technological Education Program. It's about preparing technicians who will work in STEM fields and preparing them in community colleges. It's a learning environment and a STEM workforce kind of program. And so the work here is looking at how such programs can reach underrepresented minorities and contribute to the robust STEM workforce. So we have, as I say, a very diverse set of investments, but we're looking always for ways to bring them together. I also wanted to feature this one. This is our our cyber security education program. NSF has a program. Congress is very interested in this program that is intended to prepare cybersecurity experts for government. So it's very sharply focused. And you have a project here, jointly with the College of Law and the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering to prepare such folks. There's huge interest in these positions. We have a jobs fair once a year, and the students from all around the country who are in these development programs then come in and meet with federal organizations. We have a bit of a problem in tracking what happens to these students in the current accountability climate. We're always supposed to figure out what happened to them, but they go to work for the CIA and the NSA, and we can't always find them after. Nonetheless, they get jobs, and we know that that's good. Okay, so just a few program highlights, and then we can have some Q&A and some discussion. First of all, for those of you who've been following EHR closely, you will know that we really are working at redefining our identity to have a bigger piece that is focused on building knowledge. It's starting with discoveries, building knowledge, contributing to the improvement infrastructure. And if you've seen me give talks on this, you've seen my extremely complicated diagrams. Finally, somebody said, Joan, those are way too just find a simple diagram. This is better. So those are all gone now out of these slides, and we're down to this kind of cyclic understanding. So the concept that people come to NSF, come to EHR, and they have a great research question. They think they would like to understand more about any number of things, all the great talks that we heard yesterday being examples. And very often to do that work in education, as you know, requires that you build something, that you create the sample classroom lessons, the assessment tools, the interview protocols. You have to build something in order to actually probe this question. And you have to then implement that something. So that's the development and model building. It might be as simple as what are the interview questions. It might be as complex as what is a teacher education summer activity, a professional development activity going to look like. And you do that work and you implement it and you start to watch what it looks like in practice and you realize, uh-oh, these interview questions didn't work. Or for this particular population in my summer program, they don't have enough background knowledge on X to do this. So I have to rethink my questions a little bit. I have to come back and reframe, and then I might have to develop further. So that's one way that people come into EHR. They come with something that they're curious about, that the literature has provoked, that their experience has provoked, and they go through this cycle kind of starting on the left-hand side. More frequent historically for NSF and EHR has been that people come in from the other side. They start and they say, I've got a great idea for how to, Max Bieberman, how to fix high school mathematics. And I'm going to create a curriculum that does this and this and this, and we're going to do our very best to engage more kids more successfully in high school mathematics. That starts from a development perspective, and what we're trying to push and trying to include in our calls and so forth is that that can still be quite closely tied to a research question, right? Like Max Bieberman, surely, and I don't know enough about this history, but he had a sort of hypothesis about what he wanted to put in that high school curriculum and why that would be good for kids. And that becomes a sort of research issue that can be examined through research or through evaluation in some ways. And so we are really trying to work with our communities, and every chance we get, talk to them about this cycle and the fact that you can enter a couple of different ways, but it still becomes a goal for us to learn about whatever this work is teaching us. And be able to share that beyond whatever the work is. One very useful tool has been a document that got created, and I use this in a different talk, so sorry about the slide footer. A document that got created, it's called Common Guidelines for Education Research and Development, that we completed jointly with IES a year or so ago, a little over a year ago. And it was meant to clarify the fact that doing work that is quite foundational in education, like up in A in that part of the diagram, early stage exploratory work meant to clarify constructs, design instruments, help to develop hypotheses that might be tested in other ways, look at phenomena. That's research. That can be done in rigorous ways. We were working with IES to kind of broaden out their definition of rigorous research, which had been previously very confined to randomized controlled trials. So that became a category in this work. B, which is design and development projects, design experiments, and so forth, teaching experiments. A lot of work of that type is funded by NSF, not so much by IES. We also wanted to talk about what standards would look like there. And then finally, what you might think of more closely with IES, the impact studies, efficacy, effectiveness, and scale-up work that they are funding at large scale. But it was a fantastic collaboration with them because our program people came together and agreed. And so now we're referencing this document in our solicitations, and so are they. So three areas that I wanted to mention, I guess, to wrap up. First is our core research funding. Now, those of you who have had funding from the other directorates know that they are organized around their core funding. And then they also fund some infrastructure. Many of them fund a lot of infrastructure, and they fund some education and training, postdocs, maybe special graduate programs, special traineeship programs. But in some of those directorates, their core research dollars are as high as 60% of their budget, maybe even higher in some places. So when you look at the NSF budget, which I'm sure you all read because it's riveting, it comes out in the spring. It actually is worth reading. I guess maybe I've been with government too long. But it will tell you where we're headed, and it's worth reading in that regard. But you look at the RNRA directorates, and you will see that they categorize their funding by how much of it is core research or basic research, and then how much is infrastructure, how much is education and training. And you see these different percentages, and they vary quite a lot by division and by program as well. When the directorate leadership, when we're talking with one another and we want to start something new, the RNRA assistant directors can always say, well, we'll just take that out of core. Or we can't take that out of core because that's too important to the community and we don't want to take money there. EHR never had a core. We always had the union of a set of programs that added up to, whose budgets added up to the total of our budget. A lot of programs instituted by congressional mandate or by congressional interest over the years. So one thing we've been really concentrating on over the last 4 years is to make our own core so that we can be a better partner to the other directorates when they come and say, we've got this really great idea in cyber learning. Do you have any money any place that you could kind of start to help bring toward that? So we now have a core, and it's called EHR Core. This is at a time when the rest of NSF is starting to move away from the language of core because they are wanting to use descriptors like foundational work or fundamental work, and core integrates fully with other initiatives. So anyway, that's a whole different thing. But we're okay. We've got core for now. And this in 15 is proposed to be at 61 million. So what we've been trying to do is move programs around and realign things and create a place where education researchers and developers can come with their ideas, where you don't have to fit the prescriptive nature of several of our existing programs. And hopefully, we'll be watching this very closely. This will be where we see some ideas that are brand new, that we just have not even seen ideas in that territory coming in. It will also be the place where established researchers and beginning researchers alike can see a trajectory for their work. So it's not as though you had a DRK-12 project one year and you want to continue that work and it doesn't quite fit DRK-12, so you have to contort it to fit DRK-12 enough to get funded. It's our hope that this will stimulate programs of work and people continue to bring their next new ideas and come in. And that it will stimulate work across our 3 pillars that I mentioned from the advisory committee. And so we're watching that. There are people here with awards from ECR, so congratulations. There have only been a couple of rounds, and so if you've gotten an award early on, that's great. And we're very excited about having this. Related to this is another area that we've built, and I talked to a few folks yesterday about it, but there seemed to be interest, so I thought I'd mention it here. Prime. We have to do a lot of evaluation of our education programs, partly because Congress wants us to, and the Office of Management and Budget wants us to, and we want to, because the idea is we need to understand through evaluation and research what's working for whom, under what conditions, and why. And so we started a program to encourage people to develop methodologies that would allow for stronger evaluation work in STEM education programmatic areas. And that's been a nice program, excuse me, a very broad portfolio. Now people are saying, well, should I apply to Prime or to Core? And well, that'll all have to work itself out. But Prime has been the place where we're seeing building up of instrumentation, of statistical methodologies that can be used in some of our education work. And in 14, you may have seen our call for work on STEM indicators. And we funded a small number of projects. They just had their kickoff PI meeting last week. This is in response to congressional interest in building an indicator system that would let us study the progress of STEM education across the nation. And so the question is, what would we measure if we wanted to do that? The National Academies did a report. They came up with 14 things that we should measure. And these grants are now to the field to say, all right, how really would we measure time spent on science instruction in K through 6? I mean, that was one of the indicators. What's available to measure this? What would make for valid and reliable measurement, and so forth? So that's coming through in Prime, and we're seeing some interesting work there. And then finally, I wanted to mention I-Core. So it turns out that Illinois is an I-Core site, which means that the university already has infrastructure and investment in this area from NSF. Here was the idea of I-Core. It was Subra Suresh's idea, our last director. He figured that a lot of NSF core funding, actually, was producing great findings, great interesting results that possibly had commercial potential, but that weren't getting out of the lab. It's the kind of classic Valley of Death concept. And so the idea was give small grants, $50,000, to those PIs who could kind of argue that they thought maybe their idea had commercial potential, put with them a graduate student or a postdoc who was eager to learn to be an entrepreneur, and some sort of a mentor, a venture capitalist, someone who had been able to commercialize work in one form or another, run them through a training program to learn how to essentially pitch their product and find out if it had potential, and then move toward commercialization. I'm curious if we have any I-Core folks here. Okay, so you've got people on your campus who do know about this. And we in education kept saying, well, we want to be in this too. And the response sort of was, well, yes, you are, because there's education involved. These folks go through a training course to learn to be entrepreneurs. I said, okay, get that. But we've got projects, these R&D projects, that are producing work that has commercial potential. And we also can imagine that maybe the work could get scaled up in different ways. So last year we started I-Core L. And we launched a Dear Colleague letter. It's about stimulating innovation in STEM education. And we called for proposals from the field where people thought they might have something that either was commercializable or was worthy of widespread use. So we kind of opened it up a little beyond we think we can make money from this project to say we think this really might have national impact if we could figure out how to get it in the hands of many people. We did this DCL on the basis of a little pilot that we ran the year before with funding from the Intel Foundation, yes, to fund a few undergraduate education and engineering projects. So they've been through I-Core training, and now we've just gotten in our first round from this DCL, and we have a lot that have said they'd like to be part of I-Core going forward. So we're trying to work on the concept of scaling, which is quite important for us as well. I guess I did have one other thing to mention. We are, in the Broadening Participation category, very interested in Hispanic serving institutions, in addition to historically black colleges and universities and tribal colleges and universities. And so last year we offered a Dear Colleague letter. We zeroed in on the question of helping students from HSIs that are community colleges move to 4-year programs, where our analyses had indicated that that's a fairly serious falling off point for Hispanic students. So that was a call, and we're looking at those now. And then finally, a collaboration with engineering. This is on undergraduate education. EHR and I believe computer science are both collaborating with engineering that is running this project, this call on revolutionizing engineering departments, with the focus again on broadening participation. So this is to illustrate that we try to think about new ideas. We try to collaborate with our partners to address major challenges. So that gives you a sense of what we're doing at EHR, I hope, and I'm happy to answer your questions now. Thanks. top.
Can you say a little bit more about that evaluation capability effort that's going on across?
Mm-hmm. Right. So many federal agencies have an evaluation office, a large office that is concerned with kind of at arm's length evaluating program impact. And you think of major departments like labor and HHS and so forth. You can imagine the scope and capacity of these offices. The Office of Management and Budget over the years has noted those and has been very interested in having other agencies build a sort of accountability kind of capacity. So in the budget request, I believe for 13, NSF proposed to build something called an evaluation and assessment capability. So we didn't call it an office because we were struggling internally to figure out what that would be. EHR has quite substantial evaluation commitment and some expertise, actually. So we've been doing our own evaluation work for a number of years. But cross-cutting programs like the GRF program, the IGRT program before it, the Inspire and I-Core, some of these that are agency-wide, there hasn't been a home at NSF for looking at either the return on investment in those programs or their impact. So we proposed to start one which would be a foundation-wide operation. And that is coming along. There have been a couple of positions posted over the last couple of years, and so I don't have the details. But that group will be formed, and then we'll work very closely with the rest of NSF in a distributed fashion to make sure that we are doing, continuing to do evaluation. But they'll bring expertise. Right now, what they've been helping with quite a lot has been the portfolio analysis process. Turns out there are multiple tools that can be used inside NSF to analyze our portfolios of funded projects, which is something we have to do all the time, it turns out. So I get calls from Congress and they'll say, what have you funded in the area of, what was the most recent one? I can't remember. But they might say something like citizen science for middle school kids that's focused in biology. I mean, the questions can be that specific. So we need really good search tools and analytic tools. But beyond that, in our new push for transparency and accountability, which you may have heard of, we are really needing to be able to capture what a portfolio looks like so that a grant decision can be made kind of in a bigger context, to get us a little bit out of the business of grant by grant kind of discussion. So we are looking to be able to embed any given grant in a bigger description, really, of what's being funded. So that office is taking a lead right now in looking at different tools, helping program folks learn to use them and so forth. So I think it's one to watch because it's going to be a huge help to the agency.
But it's not. I take it from what you just said, it's not assuming a role like the inspectors general.
No. It's part of NSF. It's meant to be quite collaborative with the rest of NSF. And also to tackle problems that individual directorates would find difficult or would be beyond them. So for example, just the investment in research is very difficult and problematic to evaluate. What would it mean to say, NSF's investment in research was successful? So they're trying to take on those hard questions and give us a space for talking about them. That all said, I imagine inspectors general across government are quite interested in these operations too.
Yeah. So, Joan, thank you for wonderful talk.
Thanks.
If you sort of analyze the STEM workforce needs, a lot of that is not a four-year degree.
Correct.
Right? So, with that in mind, as you think about how have money's distribution of dollars and emphases changed towards focusing on community colleges, for instance, and are you actually funding community college proposals directly or in partnership with 4 years?
So we have been, EHR has been funding community colleges directly for some time in this ATE, Advanced Technological Education Program, as well as supporting NRC studies that have looked at such things as the middle skills jobs and 21st century skills, and trying to give more clarity to the kind of preparation that might be needed for those kinds of positions. So the answer is yes, trying to step that up actually, in part in concert with the administration's college opportunity interest, where the idea is to get more kids able to go through and finish college. And so we have a very robust, not just in ATE, but in other programs like I didn't mention iTest. Does anybody know? I know WAD does, anybody knows iTest. iTest has a number of community college partners, as does the Lewis-Stokes Alliances for Minority Participation. So we've always had a kind of robust group of community colleges. What we're trying to push now a little bit more is, I think, the transition from community colleges to four-year colleges as well, and what does readiness look like, and how do we help support that. So, yeah.
Gloria.
I was at the DR K-12 DR conference this summer, and one nice thing was that we put together PIs from projects, not to say this is, I'm doing something wonderful,
Yeah.
which there were wonderful things, but it was more like I'm stuck with this
Yeah.
problem. How can I get help?
Yeah.
And a nice thing was to discover that many of us were struggling
The same problems.
with the
Yep.
same problems.
Yep.
But also that maybe our grants had a very small piece for resources for solving that problem. For example, measures of teacher knowledge,
Yep.
right? It's a huge question.
Right.
Many people are scattered trying to answer that. It's a
Right.
pressing issue to just get them out. So what are the efforts that are happening at NSF or to get people more connected to solve problems together and to sort of
Yeah,
help
it's
each other out?
it's a
just
great.
solving big problems?
We really struggle with that. I mean, that's one of the questions I sort of lose sleep over, because going to the core research funding in some ways opens up lots of things, and in some ways creates even more of that kind of a problem, potentially, right? Because you can have completely disconnected work. Even when the literature is being examined, the work is still not always well connected. So what we're doing isn't big enough. So I'm really interested in ideas from the field on this. For example, within core, let's just say within STEM professional development, professional workforce. I think of teachers as being a part of the professional workforce. We could do such things, and it's kind of counter to the concept of core, but it might be needed in education. We could do such things as say, this year, we are especially interested in projects that are looking at measures of teacher knowledge in science, let's say. And so once we get that set, that becomes a mini portfolio that could be kind of jointly managed by the same PD, handled in PI meetings in different ways. But that would come at some cost, because it would be picking an area and not having the openness that we want. So we do struggle with this. The other thing that I started to mention, this transparency, I don't know if you followed this, but last winter, I guess sometime, Dr. Merritt, when she was acting director of the agency, issued a letter to the community that said, we are going to be very heavily focused on transparency and accountability. This is all in conjunction with being able to make the argument that our investments are benefiting society and are benefiting the nation. And so the transparency piece has to do with, at a sort of low level, better titles. We're changing your titles if they come in and they're cute, but that they aren't descriptive of your work. Sorry. And you know that if you've had a title changed. We are working with your project summaries to write abstracts together that are very clear for the public, and that include a sentence about how this particular project fits in some bigger something. So to be able to write that sentence, we have to analyze our portfolio, which we are doing a lot more of, as I mentioned in my answer to Tom. So we're really taking a look at what's the body of work in any given area, and how does a given grant grow that. So we're getting to a point where we have that internal information. Now we have to bring it out to the field somehow. It's a good question. Yes?
What you're doing in terms of growing your core
Yep.
is powerful, and I like that science model. But one thing that's happening is big problems require big money. But it seems to me, as you start moving towards knowledge building, in education we have burdens that the scientists don't have to deal with, which is most of the time in big grants that we have, we're expected to create the community, create the environment,
Right.
and then do the research.
Right.
So when you get a big grant like in this project, we brace ourselves, but because we know for 2 years we're not going to be collecting data.
Right.
We're going to be creating the cohort,
Right.
creating
The
training,
development work,
creating
yep.
the partnerships, and then moving
Right.
on. And so whenever you put an idea to NSF that's research-based, our reviewers in the education world are still going to be asked,
Right.
and what does this mean, and where's
Right.
the learning? So
Right.
there's a tension there.
Mhm.
And I think there's a mindset that needs to be transformed, especially when you think about big data. There's so many things we need to know even before
Right.
we take this anywhere.
Right.
So it would be interesting to see what kind of directive can be put to sort of say, it's okay to have $1 million to do this work, and say, maybe this is going to point us in a direction that's
Yeah.
going to have real-time assessment based on keystrokes. We're not going to have it in this 2-year
Right.
grant or 3-year grant.
It's a great point, another thing that we worry a lot about. I would add, though, that if you look across the sciences, there's a level of infrastructure and data sharing and collaborative work that is a little different from what I observe in the education community. Where, let's take, what would be interesting to think about? EarthCube. Anybody know EarthCube? It's a project funded by the Geosciences Directorate at NSF that includes, as I understand it, or iPlant would be another, includes platforms for sharing of data, for places where people can choose to reanalyze other people's data, where various kinds of instruments, tools, approaches, techniques can be shared and adapted and used. But where the idea is that there needs to be a sort of platform and infrastructure for the whole community to use, and then people come in with their specific projects. An extreme example is the old-fashioned approach to buying time on the telescope or on the beam line or something, right? So the idea is that the infrastructure gets taken care of somehow, and there's cost to that, and the RNRAs, unlike EHR, do have huge infrastructure costs, so that's a bit of a difference. But then the community kind of plugs into that. And so it might be quite interesting to imagine what could that look like, at least for a portion of the work that gets done in education. And how the education community could organize itself to imagine that is hard for me to picture, because we're so diverse and we study so many different things with so many different methodologies. But the concept of every graduate student creating their own data set, maybe we don't need to do that I mean, I think there are things we can think about.
Peter, could you talk a little bit about the role, if any, of organization-based research in EHR? A lot of the salient issues in human resource development certainly connect with formal education institutions, but go beyond and look at issues of organizational learning, lifelong, life-wide learning that takes place in workplaces, institutions,
Yes.
for-profit or
Yes.
not-for-profit organizations. And so I'd like to see, address that.
So I actually heard an interesting example this morning, which you can learn more about from Fouad, about his the team that worked on Enlist, right, which took an organizational change perspective, as I understand it. But in general, we don't see as much of that as I think we should. We tried last year, in a partnership with the Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences, we had a solicitation called Building Collaborative Communities, where the idea was that, at least from our side, that certain education problems were being examined without sufficient look at the context, the social context around them. So it's a little bit like your question, looking at the school setting, looking at issues of poverty, looking at issues of community involvement with the school. So we have a great tradition of our math and science educators zoom right in on some very particular problem. So we were looking in the big data context at what would happen if you partnered social scientists with education researchers to enrich the look, which had the potential for the thing you're describing. It worked unevenly. We didn't get a lot of strong proposals, I think, in the end. So absolutely important, and will be accomplished, I suppose, by programs that allow for more interdisciplinarity. Places where it's easy. Again, our core, I think, might be one place. But.
Jose?
I'd like you to comment on a criticism I've heard for many years on the research end of EHR, not the development end, which is that unlike other directorates at NSF that builds on prior knowledge and can have programmatic research for 10, 20 years, EHR tends to be a project by project kind of thing. So it doesn't allow, if you come in with a project that builds on something new, it doesn't not looked at very
Right.
favorably.
So that's a great question. I've heard it too as a concern, and I think that has to be unpacked a little bit, because it's really only recently that we've had the core, although we could do some analysis of Reese and its precursor role to really know for sure. But this project by project mentality, I think, is very much present in programs like DRK-12 and iTest and ASIL, which was formerly Informal Science Education, and IUs, which was formerly TWOs. The programs that really started as development projects, development programs, come build a great piece of curriculum, come create a wonderful course, create an opportunity for teachers. Those areas, I think, I would agree with your observation there, that unless there's some new idea, new twist, new angle, new potential learning. Now it's becoming difficult to get sort of refunded to do kind of the same thing. But in the research programs, in REASE, in REAL, in ROLL, and now in CORE, it's my hope that we will see less of that. That's where programmatic work really will have a chance to thrive as it does in the other directorates. So. But we'll have to stay in good touch. The field and NSF are going to have to really keep that conversation open.